Hi, and welcome to the Sound of Science. Today we will be learning about living things, their needs, and their characteristics. So, to start with, you guys are taking a class called biology. Biology literally means the study of living things. Bio means life, ology is the study of. Makes sense. Living things we're going to refer to as organisms, mainly because at this point you've reached high school and organism is a more appropriate term. Organisms may include things such as bacteria, protists, fungi, plants, or animals. Um, but when we talk about living things, it's important to understand that there are some characteristics that all living things share. And that's what we're going to discuss as we move forward, what those characteristics are and things that maybe don't qualify as a living thing, but may have some of those characteristics as well. So, to start with, one of the most important things that I like my students to know is that viruses are not considered living. The reason is because they don't have all of the characteristics of living things. And this is the primary one. Viruses don't contain any cells, they're not even a single cell. All living things, all organisms are going to be made of cells. We're actually going to hear that phrase a little bit later this semester, but for right now, what you need to know is that there are multiple types of cells, um, but you have to have at least one of them to be considered a living thing. So, cells are the smallest unit that we can consider living. It's the smallest organisms are actually made up of single cells. We call them unicellular. Simple cells, like the ones that are found with bacteria, are considered prokaryotic. This means no nucleus. And I always tell my students, pro means no nucleus. So, no nucleus or prokaryotic, they're not going to have any membrane around their DNA. They're not going to have any membrane bound organelles. So, no mitochondria. They can still function, and obviously bacteria function quite well. But in the case of prokaryotes, they're missing some of the more complex things that other organisms have. Complex cells we typically refer to as eukaryotic. These guys have a nucleus and membrane bound organelles. All of those things are important. So they have those more complex, complicated designs, and they're also designed where they can be either unicellular or there are organisms that are eukaryotes, like us, that have multiple cells or a multicellular. Another characteristic of living things is that they're able to reproduce. There are multiple types of reproduction that organisms may use. And on the next couple of slides, we're going to talk about those different types of reproduction that are possible. The first type of reproduction is what most people think of. This is sexual reproduction. It involves two parents. The offspring are different from both parents. Offspring, of course, are the babies or the kids that they're having. And really, when we talk about them being different, what we're really talking about is the genetic material. The genetic material is different. If you take half of the DNA from one parent and half the DNA from the other and you combine them together, you're going to have something that's not an identical copy of the parents. Asexual reproduction, on the other hand, involves a single organism or a single cell. Often, offspring are going to be identical to the parent. They are really a clone, they're an exact genetic copy. Now, obviously, there are going to be instances, of course, and in biology, what you're going to find is there's almost always an exception to the rule. With the case of asexual reproduction, where I've said that it's almost always a single cell, oftentimes you will find that it is. It's going to be things like bacteria or unicellular protists that are reproducing asexually. But larger organisms are capable of this type of reproduction as well. In fact, some Some cnidarians, jellyfish, corals are capable of reproducing this way, as well as sponges and other types of organisms. So we're going to talk about those more as we get through this semester. Just be aware that there's lots of different organisms that can reproduce asexually. Really, the most important thing to remember here is that it means it's going to be identical to the parent and it only involves a single organism. So, number 3 in the characteristic list of organisms, all of them have a genetic code. All organisms must contain DNA. DNA is deoxyribonucleic acid. Feel free to pause and try to say that a couple of times. Deoxyribonucleic acid. DNA codes for the proteins that make up cells and creates our traits as well as allows our cells to function. So think of DNA as a recipe. It's the instructions that our body is going to use or our cells are going to use to make the proteins that make us who we are. Not only does it build our bodies, but it also allows our bodies to function the way that they're supposed to. So, number 4, all organisms grow and develop. And here we see the example of the frog. It starts off as eggs, it goes into a tadpole, it goes through metamorphosis, and it becomes a little froglet kind of thing. And then eventually it turns into an adult frog that repeats the process by reproducing, laying eggs, and so on and so forth. So we're going to see this type of growth. And this is what most people think of. But also keep in mind that humans are living things. We are organisms and we also grow and develop. And so some organisms are going to change massively from their early stages to their later stages, but not all will. And so keep that in the back of your head as you're thinking about growth and development. There doesn't have to be major changes, but all organisms do grow from the time that they begin till the time that they end. Growth is accomplished by producing more cells. Cells do this, of course, through cell division. The example of things like this, your hair grows through reproduction of cells or production of proteins in the scalp. Your nails are also going to produce this way. Scabs are included as an example. Scabs can be found covering over anywhere that there's been some type of injury, some type of opening in the epidermis and the skin. So you're going to produce a scab to sort of cover that up. Development means that you are going to be maturing into an adult organism. This is the example of that tadpole eventually becoming a frog, or a caterpillar becoming a butterfly, or a baby eventually growing up into an adult. So growth and development looks different for each organism, but I want to make sure that you understand what they are. Growth just means to get bigger. Development means changes that allow maturity, or changes as they mature. Okay, all living things metabolize energy, and we usually think of metabolism as something we use like to digest our food, right? Some organisms use chemicals to produce energy. Some create glucose through the use of the sun, and then break down that glucose to produce energy. Regardless, all living things must metabolize. So, what is metabolism? Metabolism is just the sum of all the chemical reactions in an organism. Basically, every reaction that you do in your body is part of your metabolism. Metabolizing energy is talking about obtaining and using energy to carry out the functions that the body requires. And again, don't forget that we're not talking just about humans or just about animals. We're talking about plants, we're talking about bacteria, we're talking about all living things must metabolize. Autotrophs are able to make their own food. These guys are considered self-feeders. In fact, auto means self, troph means food or feeding. And when we say an autotroph can make its own food, we don't mean it can like walk into the kitchen, it can make a sandwich, get a side of fruit. It doesn't do that. When we say autotroph, what we're meaning is it's able to use something other than living things to get food. So autotrophs are going to be things like photoautotrophs or chemoautotrophs. Photoautotrophs use sunlight to make food. These are things like plants and algae. They are going to do photosynthesis. You guys have heard of this before, right? Chemoautotrophs are going to use chemicals like iron and sulfur as their energy. And these are organisms you may not have heard about. If you've ever heard anybody talk about the bacteria that live at the deepest levels of the ocean where there's sulfur vents that sort of vent this sulfuric gas out into the ocean. Um, these guys are the chemoautotrophs. They don't require sunlight. They're able to do this in the dark, but they are still using it to gain energy, and they're using it as part of their metabolism. Heterotrophs cannot make their own food. Again, not that they're lazy, they can't go to the kitchen, they can't figure out how to boil water. It's that they don't have the correct parts, they don't have the right organelles, they don't have the right pigments to allow them to be able to make their own food. They can't make glucose. So they have to consume other organisms in order to obtain the glucose they need for energy. A couple of different types we can talk about. We've got herbivores, they eat plants, carnivores eat meat, omnivores eat both plants and meat. And you're going to hear more about these as we move through the semester. Um, One of the things I like to point out at this stage is that we're not just talking about animals here. Fungi, mushrooms, these guys are heterotrophs. They can't make their own food. That's why molds and funguses grow in dark places. They're actually going to be absorbing their nutrients and absorbing their food to metabolize. Okay, so number 6, all living things respond to stimuli. And this is probably one of the most important things, as well as one of my favorite slides because I get to talk about these pictures. So, examples of stimuli, these are things in the environment that we can respond to: temperature, water, food, supplies, any of that type of stuff. The example that I give here, the written example, is the rooster crowed at dawn. So which part of that is the stimulus? The rooster crowing or it being dawn? Well, in this case, it's dawn. Dawn is what caused the rooster to crow. So all of this is showing you response to stimuli. These pictures, the cat is responding or the kitten is responding to something that's frightened it. In the case of the individuals in the haunted house, I love the look. The guy with the green shirt is like, you're not getting away. If it's going to kill me, you're going down with me. He is not letting his friend go. But that is a response to a stimuli. And yes, that is set up as a picture taking opportunity in a haunted house. There's about 100 of these photos. Online, they are absolutely hysterical. Some are better than this. I just particularly like this one. But when we talk about responding to stimuli, the whole idea is that it can be an external stimuli or it can be something that's internal. So when we talk about internal stimuli, these are things like when your glucose level starts to drop, your body is going to start to produce hormones that will make you feel hungry because it knows that you need sugar, or it will produce the proteins required to break down glycogen, which is a starch where we store some of that sugar that we need. Things like sweating or shivering. If you're cold and you start to shiver, that's a response to stimuli. And it's all about maintaining homeostasis, trying to maintain a stable internal condition. So that's what homeostasis means, and stable internal condition. So if you can sweat and bring your temperature down, you're maintaining homeostasis. If you are running Your lungs will start working a little bit harder. You'll get a little bit out of breath. That's because your body is trying to take in more oxygen to maintain enough oxygen to support your muscles. So all of these things are examples of response to stimulus. So I know you're sitting there thinking, how do plants respond to stimuli? Because really plants just kind of sit there and grow, right? Well, their growth allows them to respond to stimuli. Plants actually go through something in the very beginning called thigmotropism. And thigmotropism is when a plant, as it's growing, its tendrils touches something, it'll actually cause it to swirl around it. You guys have seen this with vines. Gravitropism is what seeds use. It tells them which way is up and which way is down, so it knows that the shoots grow up and the roots grow down. And we also have phototropism for plants. Plants will actually grow in the direction of the light because they are trying to keep the plant as healthy as possible. And they're trying to make sure they have access to water, access to sunlight, access to the things that they need. So all of those are examples of responses to stimuli. Okay, and so of course we've talked about maintaining homeostasis a little bit already, and just here's a slide that just kind of gives it to you more written. But keeping those internal conditions within the ranges required for life, those stable internal conditions, keeping your pH stable, the temperature, the water balance, and all of those things. We actually have things that sort of float around in our bloodstream called buffers that will help maintain our pH. And all of these things are important because living things have a range and they have to stay within that very specific range or they can't survive. For example, temperature. Temperature is a range. So humans can pretty much do okay. 96, 97, we start to have problems being too cold. Over 103, 104, we start to have problems being too hot. And so that's one of the reasons why we need to maintain that homeostasis, make sure that we stay within that very tiny range of temperature that we can survive at. If we get too much above or too much below that temperature, then our enzymes don't work and our cells can't function. Okay, so number 8 is evolve. So organisms all evolve, not as individual organisms though, but as an entire species. And this doesn't happen over the course of one organism's lifetime. This is something that happens over the course of many, many generations. For bacteria, many generations can occur in 24 hours. For humans, many generations occurs over hundreds or thousands of years. So species are all slowly changing over time. They're responding to their environment, and really, they are becoming better adapted to their environment. So evolution is something that happens, like I said, very, very slowly. Pokemon evolution is not a thing. It doesn't, I'm not outside of the Pokemon universe. It doesn't happen here. All right, last thing that I want to talk about in this video, it's gone on long enough, are the levels of organization. So living things are going to be organized really from the small units to the larger ones. And it's important that you kind of understand the levels as we move up, as we get larger. So obviously atoms are the smallest. Now, atoms are not going to be the smallest unit of life. These are just the smallest unit of matter that we're really going to talk about. Obviously, there's atomic particles, things like quarks, there's neutrons and electrons, and we're going to talk all about that in the next video. But right now, what I want you to focus on is atoms are the smallest component of an element. Atoms come together and they make molecules. Molecules will come together into organelles, and organelles form themselves together into cells. This is the first point where we can talk about life. Cells are the smallest unit of life. That's why you have to have at least one cell to be considered living. Cells can come together, ones that do the same basic job, and they're going to form a tissue. Tissues make up organs. So you get several different types of tissues together, and that's going to form an organ like the heart. It has all sorts of different types of tissue. It has muscular tissue, it's going to have some vascular tissue in it. So all of these different things. Organs can come together to form an organ system. So your heart, and paired with your arteries and your veins, this is all part of your organ system, your circulatory system. And then, of course, your organ system is going to come together, several organ systems together, and they're going to make an organism. So, just to recap, atoms make molecules, molecules make organelles, organelles make cells. This is the smallest unit of life. Cells come together to make tissues, tissues come together to make organs, organs come together to make organ systems make organisms. But we're not going to stop there, because organisms can actually come together and form a population. That's all the members of the same species in an area. That's your population. The same type of organisms coming together is your population. Populations of different organisms can come together to form a community. And this is in the sense of not the community like, oh, I live in the Deep Creek community. This is more of the sense of all the living things in an area. This is an ecological community. Communities come together with the non-living aspects of an area, and that forms your ecosystem. And then, of course, the largest thing we're going to talk about this semester is the biosphere, which is literally all the living parts of the planet Earth. So hopefully this has given you a good idea about biology and what we're going to be studying, and what organisms are, as well as what they're not. So at this time, of course, I want you to go back through, make sure your notes, you feel good on your notes, and I look forward to seeing you guys tomorrow.